Welcome back to the Explanation Pro. Today I'll recap a war film called Danger Close. Spoilers ahead. The movie centers around the Battle of Long Tan during the Vietnam War. The main character, Major Smith, writes a letter during the early hours of the morning. He then crumples the paper and thinks before an explosion happens outside his camp. He then grabs a gun and walks outside calmly, telling his men to take cover. Smith then enters a tent and tells the soldiers to get the trajectory of the mortars from the different platoon leaders. Meanwhile, Sergeant Buick watches as Lieutenant Sharp continues to play a card game and drink while the base is being attacked. Buick tries to get outside, but a nearby explosion forces him to hide in one of their holes. He then goes back inside the tent and asks them again to treat the attack seriously, but Sharp continues to ignore him. Buick then walks towards the table and slams it before telling the men to go get armed and defend the base. In their main headquarters, the soldiers scramble as they have yet to receive proper bearings so that they could fire back at the enemy. Their commanding officer then arrives and sends some of the men out to defend. Two soldiers, one of them named Private Large, lays around and talk about an upcoming concert in camp. A shot fires their way, although they're not able to accurately fire back. Their main headquarters finally get all the bearings they need and figure out a spot where they soon authorize a mortar attack. The next morning, Townsend sends the Bravo Company to go to Long Tan to find the enemy mortars that attacked them the previous night. He ignores Smith trying to volunteer his men for the mission. Buick starts to orient the new troops while Large is sent to Smith. Smith asks him why he didn't get to shoot an enemy during the attack, choking him as a threat before sending him off. Later on, he's approached by one of his men. He tells Smith that his company had been trained well by him and that he should respect them at the very least. Smith ignores him. He then listens to Bravo's radio before he goes to the office of his superior officer and tries to ask for a transfer, saying he feels underused in his current position. The officer rejects him, however, saying that he can't just choose freely where to go, and being part of the military means that he should know how to follow orders. The next morning, two Australian artists named Colonel Joy and Little Paddy arrive to have a concert at the base. Large catches Little Paddy's attention and convinces her to kiss his friend on the cheek for motivation. Smith then soon tells his men that they're being sent to Long Tan to retrieve Bravo Company. Some of his men feel frustrated that they'll be missing the concert while Buick reprimands them. Once they arrive, they find footprints as well as cart tracks. Smith sends 11 platoon, led by Sharp, to follow the cart tracks. The platoon soon finds the enemy troops and informs Smith before chasing after them. Townsend gets updated about the situation while he watches the concert. 11 platoon soon finds a small house in the middle of the woods. Some of them search it and find explosives and fresh blood. Once they walk outside, the enemy starts to fire at them, forcing them to drop to the ground. Smith then sends 10 platoon to help them. They then contact their main headquarters and ask for some artillery support. Meanwhile, the concert is cut short as all the soldiers are ordered back to the station as the conflict escalates. Townsend then updates their commanding officer and they mistakenly underestimate the number of their enemy. 10 platoon gets confronted by the enemy and their radio gets destroyed. One of them returns to Smith's location to update them. 11 platoon contacts Smith and tells them that they are outnumbered and that Sharp, their platoon leader, had died. 12 platoon soon arrives and joins up with Smith just as the soldier from 10 platoon arrives. Large sneaks out to find 11 platoon. Back in their camp, Townsend plans to send armored personnel carriers to aid them, but his commanding officer stops him. 11 platoon then encounters a sniper hiding inside the small house they searched earlier. After the sniper takes a shot, they all aim at the house and immediately get rid of the enemy. They contact headquarters and tell them that the enemy may be almost 800 in number. Headquarters then turn to the Americans for help. Meanwhile, Large finds two Vietnamese women helping a wounded soldier of theirs. He then lets them leave. Later on, fighter jets from the US arrive to help but fail to directly aid 11 platoon after their smoke signal doesn't work. Buick asks his men how much ammunition they have left and finds out that almost all of them are nearly out. Then, more Vietnamese soldiers start to approach from all sides. He contacts Smith and their headquarters and updates them on their situation, telling them to fire the artillery on their side. Smith hesitates for a few seconds but Buick insists, saying that they'll die anyway. Back at headquarters, one of the soldiers says that he doesn't want to do it. Their commanding office then tells him that it's Smith's authority and not theirs. Smith eventually concedes and tells the headquarters to proceed. He then tries to contact their unit, but there's no answer just as the thunder roars and the rain falls. Private Large arrives and approaches the unit, saying that he has found a way to reach 11 Platoon. Kirby then confronts him about his decision and doubts if he and the others can ever trust Smith ever again. Smith tells him to stand down and he leaves before he gets frustrated and starts to break down in tears. Another round of attacks starts and they start to argue in headquarters about sending reinforcements. Their commanding officer tells them that it's all a trap so that they would go to Smith's unit and leave their own base vulnerable. He nods to Townsend, who relays the message to Smith and adds that they're now being ordered to go back to their base. Smith curses at Townsend and refuses to follow these orders. He drops the line and Kirby laughs at this before asking if he has any new plans. Smith decides that they find a way to reach 11 Platoon and see if there are any survivors so that they could rescue them. Large repeats that he knows a way, so Smith sends him off with another soldier named Sabin. Smith then says that they need to reach 10 Platoon as well, and Kirby tells him that they don't have any radio. He calls another one of his men and orders him to try and find a way to deliver a radio to that unit. He contacts their headquarters and requests for more ammunition. Townsend insists that their orders are to return to their base immediately, but Smith says that if Townsend doesn't listen to him then his entire company of soldiers will die. The pilots who just arrived volunteer to take some supplies to them, despite the protests of their commanding officer. The runner reaches 10 Platoon and they're now able to phone Smith. The platoon leader, Kendall, tells him that they're also low on ammunition and have suffered casualties. Smith orders them to take their wounded companions and go to his location. The pilots arrive over the area where Smith and his company are when they're suddenly met with gunshots from the enemy. They tell Smith to release some smoke and once he does, they follow it as a signal of their location. The helicopters then drop the supplies. Smith thanks them before they leave to return back to base. He then orders his men to designate the supplies properly. Meanwhile, Large reaches 11 Platoon although they're struggling to return to Smith's location. He throws a smoke grenade to signal their companions on their location. The shots from the enemy suddenly stop so 11 Platoon holds a ceasefire. The rain stops and a couple of men appear behind the smoke. Sabin tells them to wave their hats if they're Australian, which they do. They then realize that the man leading them is Buick and 11 Platoon runs toward them. Sabin asks him where his other men are when suddenly, a shot fires in the air and hits one of them. The Australian soldiers fall down to the ground and Sabin quickly contacts Smith to tell him that they found 11 Platoon. Smith's company as well as the soldiers back in their base breathe a sigh of relief. Smith's company then requests for armored personnel carriers to go to their location as backup. Townsend relays the request to their commanding officer, who refuses as he does not want to leave their base unattended for Smith's men, as he sees them as simply support staff. Townsend then tells him that they can still get Smith and his company back and that they'll be able to hold back against the enemy so there won't be any major losses as the commanding officer fears. The latter then concedes and approves sending the armored personnel carriers to Smith's location. The commanding officer then forces Townsend to stay with him in their headquarters so that he can see the consequences of his actions and watch as Townsend is proven wrong. 11 and 12 platoons start to retreat as the APCs gather and prepare to go aid them. The two platoons soon arrive back at Smith's location. Smith is relieved to see that Buick is alive while Buick thanks him for sending the artillery as he asked, stating that they wouldn't be alive if Smith didn't follow him. Meanwhile, Paddy is crawling through the forest as he tries to get back to the others. A group of Vietnamese soldiers passes by and he drops down, pretending to be dead. Once they leave, the soldier grits his teeth and continues to crawl. Smith then starts to brief the other soldiers before asking them if they have any questions. One of them asks where Sharp is and Buick answers that he's already dead. Headquarters contacts Smith to tell him that the APCs are on the way to their location, however it will take them an hour to get there so Smith should hold off for that long. Smith then tells them that they really don't have a choice anyway. The commanding officer then rounds up every person in camp to be prepared to defend the entire base. Smith calls Large over and tells him to sit down. He then tries to start small talk about Large's private and family life. Large tells him about his family and his fiancée, expressing his wish to go home so he can get married. The other soldiers see a moving figure from afar and start to shoot. They stop as they realize that it's Paddy. One soldier rushes to him and they both see more moving figures from afar and he thinks that it's other Australian soldiers. Paddy then points out that their uniform is different. The soldier and Kirby drag Paddy back to their lines. The soldier finds out that he's shot and accidentally leans on Paddy's legs. Paddy yells at him before they share a laugh until Kirby suddenly gets shot behind them. Back at the base, Townsend asks their commanding officer if he could get out to check the defenses around the base. The officer agrees and Townsend takes one private with him. Once outside, he contacts the APCs and them to return back to base to pick up Townsend so he could get to Smith's location. They initially refuse as they're running out of time but eventually send one of their men to go back. Smith and his men start their defense. More than an hour passes and he starts to wonder what's taking the APCs too long. He then orders his men to huddle closer. Meanwhile, Townsend had already been picked up by one APC and tells the others to wait for him before proceeding into the forest. The APCs don't listen and leave one of them to wait for Townsend. Smith contacts their headquarters and tells them to fire artillery at their area. The shelling starts but they immediately request a ceasefire as the shells are too close. Suddenly, lightning strikes on one of the cable poles in their base, which shuts down their power and communications. The APCs have gone deeper into the forest when they're confronted by the enemy, resulting in the death of one of them. Smith's men start to wonder why it's suddenly quiet in their area. He then approaches Large and asks him when the wedding will be. Large teases him that if he wants to attend then he'll have to bring someone else. Smith then shows him a picture of his wife and his daughters. The enemy yell from afar and Smith starts to say a speech before they return to their defense. The power has gone back on and they give a set of coordinates back to their headquarters and the artillery starts to fire once again. The Vietnamese start to advance towards them, with one of them holding a knife and running towards Smith. He manages to shoot the enemy and bring him down. Large turns towards the fight and once he turns around back at the enemy, he gets shot in the head and dies immediately. The Australians soon run out of ammo and start to grab melee weapons. They prepare to fight hand-to-hand combat as the enemy gets too close. Suddenly, the enemy gets taken down by fast shots as the APC arrives. Smith's men drop their weapons as they start to shake due to shock. With the APCs, the enemy around the area is easily wiped out. Smith calls their headquarters and tells them that the battlefield has been secured. Their commanding officer silently smokes a cigarette. Smith's company returns to their base. Townsend approaches him and says that he thinks that God and history were watching over them all throughout the battle and he mentions that they did a good job. Buick starts a roll call of the company while a group of soldiers returns to Long Tan to retrieve the corpses and find if anyone there is still alive. Smith carries the stretcher with Large's body on a helicopter and covers it back when the wind blows the cover off. A soldier approaches him and tells Smith that he can leave now. The movie ends as Smith decides to stay behind as his men are still being recovered. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and also subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. See you in the next video.